Right. Good morning, everybody. I'm back again having another go at the wasteland, and this is another go. I'm having a few technical hiccups this morning, so hopefully the rest of this is going to actually go quite smoothly. And I'm here today to talk to you about the first canto, The Burial of the Dead. Now, what does that word actually mean, canto? Well, it actually just becomes a word we use to divide up sections of longer series, pieces of poetry. It comes from the Italian word for song, which of course is a reference to the development of poetry as a literary form in European culture out of music. Um, and it's a word that's been traditionally used for quite a long time to actually divide up these longer sections of text. So the Wasteland isn't as long as we think it is. It's only 440 lines, not as long and as difficult as people actually intend, but there it goes. There it sits in its space. And it's a word that's been used by lots of great poets, people like Byron, for example, who uses the word canto to divide up his epic poems. Um, Childe Harold and Don Juan, for example, he just calls them canto 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 within his text. But T.S. Eliot gives his cantos names, and in some ways, that division of the text into cantos it actually expresses the whole idea that this is an epic text and a section of an idea of poetry that is on a journey, which is very fitting for the wasteland because there is a lot of literal and metaphorical journey that actually is about to happen in the poem. But before we actually get to the canto itself, I want to actually look at the epigraph. Now, that's a strange word. What is an epigraph? Now, an epigraph comes from the Greek word epigraphion and literally means to write on. And our very first epigraphs are inscriptions on buildings where people have written on the building, often something as simple as this building was built by this person in this year. So we still see epigraphs in that sense around, but the epigraphs in a literary sense have actually developed since the 16th century, and they're the quotations that occur at the beginning of a text or at the top of chapters, and they become really important because what those epigraphs do is give us an insight into the themes and ideas that the um, author is actually going to be exploring within the text. So let's have a look at the epigraph that T.S. Eliot uses. Okay, you say, I'm having a look. I don't understand a single word of it, and that's fair enough because it's in Latin. Now, this is a deliberate choice. It's something that we're actually going to see quite a lot. This integration of lots of other different languages and fragments of different cultures within the whole. But Latin is a really particular choice, I think, both because of the topic, which we're actually going to talk about the translation of what the actually graph means, but also in the choice of language, because Latin is the seminal root language of the European project. It's the language of the Roman Empire, the thing that actually creates this notion of a combined and unified European culture. And something there, we're going to see fragments of this harking back to the classical world quite a lot within the poem. Um, it, of course, Latin is the root of a great deal of language in Europe. It's the literal roots for languages, the languages of Italian, French, and Spanish and Romanian. It's a foundational language for English, which has borrowed so many Latin usages and Latin words into it. It becomes the language of the church. So it's the language that allows European society and civilization to communicate with itself as Europe develops as a culture and civilization over the 2,000-year period from the Greco-Roman classical period into the modern world. So the choice of Latin is actually very, very significant and important in its own right. So what does the Latin actually mean? Now, a rough and reasonable translation of it is: a girl sees a sibyl hanging in her bottle and says, "What do you want?" And the sibyl replies, "I want to die." Okay, so what does that actually mean? Who is the sibyl? Where does this actually come from? Now, there's the Sibyls of Cumae are an ancient classical myth. They are witches of great power, and they're given the power of true foretelling. They can see the future. They know what is going to happen. But there are limitations to prophecy. To quote Joss Whedon and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, prophecy is tricky. And so the Sibyl of Cumae asked the god of Apollo to give her eternal life. but all her power and all her foretelling does not actually allow her to completely understand something that's really, really important. That eternal life without eternal youth is not a gift, but it's a curse. So here is this woman, this power of nature, this force, who's given the ability to see the future. And all of that future, all of that power, all of that ability, all of that foretelling and foreknowledge, all it gives her is a life where she shrinks to something smaller and smaller, where somebody can just pick her up and put her in a jar and use her as a piece of advertising ware, because in the tradition, the bottle is actually hung outside a shop in Naples. Not necessarily where I'd like to end up, and neither would like the Sybil. And that's important in the context of the wasteland, because this is a poem in a lot of ways about the failures of foretelling, about the failures, our failures to be able to both see and control the future. The fact that we live in a world where chaos, and this idea of control is actually really not something that is actually real. It's that's a myth, a mistelling, a misunderstanding of our place in the world. And then so we get to the first canto. It has a really somber title, The Burial of the Dead. That's a fairly bleak way to start. We're putting our dead into the ground, literally. You can use it as an allusion to the Roman Mass, because burial of the dead is actually what they call the burial service. So it is this ritualized burial of the past. And then we move on then into the search for the future that we're going to see through the wasteland. Now, what we see within this text, in this opening canto, is the introduction of a whole heap of really important ideas and techniques from T.S. Eliot about our lack of control. And technically, we see the use of symbolism, we see the use of illusion, we see the use of really carefully constructed language. It opens with this series of enjambments, and these whole linking of ideas. You see in here the fragmentation that the modernists are so concerned with. You have a fragmentation of narrative voice. It's really quite difficult in places to actually understand and hear who is actually speaking, and where the voice changes from the poet to actors within the text, who is actually the voice. It's a very hard thing to determine at times within the wasteland. And perhaps much more importantly, and one of the things that makes the wasteland such a difficult text is the fragmentation of chronology. Time does not run in a linear stream in the wasteland. Past, the present, the future are smashed together. What we open up with is a now, but it is a now that is overlaid by memories of the past and desires for the future. Time is a really tricky thing. It's no linear stream here. It's fragments of time, past, present, and future, woven in together into this sort of amorphous idea about who we are and where we're going and what the past is and how we're created. So let's have a look at the opening lines. April is the cruelest month. Breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Now, you think about it, April is the cruelest month seems like, and often it's quoted as the opening line of the wasteland, and it's really important. We're going to come back to have a look at that. But you can see here how T.S. Eliot uses enjambment to link all of these ideas into this sort of unified whole, where he's making this point about lost potential, promises that are not fulfilled, dreams and futures and potentialities that come to nothing. So April is the cruelest month. Now, you remember, April is spring in Europe. It's supposed to be the beginning of this hopeful new season, and it calls it the cruelest month because in a European context, particularly in Northern European context, April can often open up with the promise of spring that is snatched away. Because you can have snow and blizzards in April. All of these promises, all of these hopes for the futures, we tangible, they're almost tangible, and then they're snatched away from people, which is why it is cruel. And this is what Eliot's poem is actually about. Promises that are lost, promises that are taken away. It's actually encapsulated the whole idea of